We are cruelest where we are safest, not to strangers, not to enemies, but to the people who know our middle name, our habits, our soft spots, the people who stay, the people who love us. This isn't a moral failure, it's a psychological pattern. And once you see it, it becomes hard to unsee, because it explains arguments that seem unnecessary, words that land harder than intended, and a quiet question many people are afraid to ask themselves: why do I only act like this with you? This topic matters because most emotional damage doesn't come from dramatic betrayals. It comes from small, repeated violations inside relationships that are supposed to feel safe. The sarcasm that cuts too deep, the silence that feels like punishment, the honesty that suddenly turns surgical. These moments don't happen randomly. They happen where attachment is strongest. The mind behaves differently when it believes it won't be abandoned. With strangers, we perform. With colleagues, we manage impressions. With acquaintances, we stay polite because the social cost of misstepping is high. But with the people we love, the cost feels lower. And that's the first uncomfortable truth. Intimacy reduces inhibition. Psychologically, love creates a zone of perceived safety. Safety doesn't just allow tenderness, it also allows disinhibition. The brain relaxes its threat monitoring systems. The same mechanisms that let you be vulnerable also let you be careless, sometimes aggressive, sometimes selfish. This is why people often say, "I didn't mean it," and genuinely believe it, because the part of the brain that usually filters impulse and tone wasn't fully online. The relationship felt secure enough to absorb the impact, but safety alone doesn't explain why the behavior can be so targeted, why we don't just lash out randomly, but hit exactly where it hurts. To understand that, you have to look at attachment. When we form close bonds, we don't just love the other person. We start regulating our emotional state through them. Their attention calms us. Their approval stabilizes us. Their presence becomes a psychological resource. And that creates dependency, not weakness, but reliance. The problem is that reliance makes the brain hypersensitive to perceived threats from that person. A delayed reply, a distracted tone, a look that could be interpreted 5 different ways. When the attachment system feels destabilized, it reacts fast and emotionally, not rationally. This is where hurtful behavior often begins, not with anger, but with fear. Fear of losing access, fear of not being important, fear of being exposed as replaceable. The mind doesn't always register this as fear. It experiences it as irritation, criticism, or sudden emotional distance. And instead of saying, "I feel insecure right now," the brain reaches for something more familiar and more protective: control. Criticism is a form of control. Withdrawal is a form of control. Even cruelty can be a form of control. If I destabilize you first, I don't have to sit with my own instability. There's also a quieter mechanism at work: expectation. We expect more from the people we love. More understanding, more patience, more emotional availability. These expectations are rarely spoken out loud, but they shape our reactions. When a stranger disappoints us, we shrug. When someone we love disappoints us, it feels personal, like a violation of an unspoken contract. So the emotional reaction is disproportionate, not because the act was worse, but because the meaning assigned to it was heavier. Psychology calls this entitlement within attachment, not entitlement in the arrogant sense, but in the emotional sense. The belief that closeness grants access, not just to affection, but to expression without consequence. This is why people often show their worst moods at home. The day's frustrations don't disappear, they get displaced. And displacement almost always flows toward the safest container. The irony is that love doesn't cause the harm, it reveals it. Close relationships remove the masks we wear everywhere else. What's underneath is not always pretty. Unresolved resentment, learned defense strategies, emotional habits formed long before the current relationship existed. When intimacy increases, these patterns surface more often. There's also the issue of memory. The people closest to us know our history. They know what matters to us, what embarrasses us, what we never quite healed from. Even when we don't consciously intend to hurt them, the brain knows exactly which words carry the most emotional weight. Under stress, it reaches for the most efficient tools available. Precision replaces restraint. And then there's reciprocity. In close relationships, emotional exchanges are tracked, even when we pretend they aren't. The mind keeps a subtle ledger. Who apologized last? Who compromised? Who gave more? When that balance feels off, even inaccurately, the brain looks for ways to restore equilibrium. Sometimes that restoration looks like a passive-aggressive comment. Sometimes it looks like emotional withdrawal. Sometimes it looks like saying the one thing you know will linger long after the argument ends. None of this feels calculated in the moment. That's what makes it dangerous. Popular culture likes to say, if they hurt you, they don't love you. Psychology says something less comforting. They may hurt you because they love you, because love removed the brakes. This doesn't excuse the behavior, but it explains why logic alone doesn't fix it. You can understand that your partner didn't mean harm and still feel the impact. Because harm isn't measured by intention, it's measured by effect. Over time, these small injuries accumulate. Trust erodes not through betrayal, but through repetition. The mind starts bracing. Conversations become negotiations. Affection becomes conditional. And the relationship quietly shifts from a place of safety to a place of vigilance. What's unsettling is how normal this process is. Most people believe they would never intentionally damage something they value. But the human mind doesn't always protect what it values most. Sometimes it tests it. Sometimes it exploits it. Sometimes it assumes it will survive anything. And that assumption, that love is resilient enough to withstand neglect, sharp words, and emotional shortcuts, is where the deepest damage often begins. Because eventually, the question stops being, "Why did you say that?" and becomes something far more uncomfortable. What part of me felt safe enough to think this wouldn't matter? Because once you believe something will always be there, you start treating it differently. Psychologists sometimes describe this as the paradox of security. The more secure an attachment feels, the less effort the mind invests in protecting it moment to moment. Not consciously, automatically. The brain reallocates its resources elsewhere, assuming the bond can absorb strain without breaking. This is efficient. It's also reckless. Think about how people treat fragile objects versus durable ones. You handle glass carefully. You drop your keys without thinking. Love, once it feels durable, starts getting treated like keys. There's another layer beneath this: identity. The people we love aren't just external figures in our lives. Over time, they become part of our psychological self. Their opinions matter more because they shape how we see ourselves. Their reactions feel bigger because they don't just reflect on us. They define us in subtle ways. So when they disappoint us or fail to mirror us the way we expect, the reaction isn't just relational, it's existential. It feels like an attack on the self. This is why arguments in close relationships escalate so quickly. They're rarely about the surface issue. They're about recognition, respect, validation, power, being seen accurately. And when those needs feel threatened, the brain switches from connection-seeking to self-defense. Self-defense is not gentle. Under threat, the mind simplifies. It looks for dominance, certainty, and emotional leverage. Nuance disappears. Curiosity disappears. What remains is the urge to regain psychological ground. Hurting the other person becomes a way to restore balance. If I feel small, I'll make you feel smaller. Again, this doesn't feel malicious from the inside. It feels justified. Another uncomfortable truth. We often hurt the people we love as a way of expressing emotions we don't know how to express cleanly. Anger is easier than sadness. Criticism is easier than vulnerability. Distance is easier than asking for reassurance and risking rejection. So the mind chooses the emotion that feels safer to hold. There's also learning history. Many people grew up in environments where closeness and pain were intertwined, where love came with unpredictability, criticism, or emotional withdrawal. The nervous system adapts to this early. It learns that intimacy is not calm, it's charged. Later in life, when a relationship feels too stable, the system gets restless. The calm feels unfamiliar, and the mind, often without realizing it, introduces tension. A comment, a test, a provocation. Not to destroy the bond, but to make it feel recognizable. Familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar peace. This is one of the most disturbing patterns in human attachment. People don't just repeat what feels good, they repeat what feels known, even when what's known is damaging. Over time, this creates a loop. Hurt leads to defensiveness. Defensiveness leads to distance. Distance increases anxiety. Anxiety fuels more hurtful behavior. And each person becomes evidence for the other's worst assumptions. At that point, the relationship isn't two people anymore. It's two nervous systems reacting to each other. What makes this especially difficult to confront is that most people don't see themselves as the source of harm. They see themselves as reacting, responding, protecting, and in a sense, they are. The mind always believes it's acting in self-defense, even when it's sabotaging the very thing it wants to preserve. Society doesn't help here. We romanticize emotional intensity. We confuse volatility with passion. We treat jealousy as proof of care, harsh honesty as depth, emotional withdrawal as strength. These narratives give people psychological cover. They turn harm into personality, and so patterns go unexamined. But the cost shows up eventually, in relationships that feel exhausting instead of nourishing, in conversations that feel tense before they even start, in the quiet realization that you're more careful with strangers than with the person you claim matters most. The most unsettling part is this: the people who are most capable of hurting us are the ones we trust the most. Not because they're cruel, but because trust gives access. Access to our vulnerabilities, our past, our meaning-making systems. And access changes behavior. The question then isn't whether this tendency exists. It does. The question is whether we notice it while it's happening, or only after the damage is done. Because once you see how the mind behaves in intimacy, you start noticing moments that used to feel normal. The pause before a cutting remark. The satisfaction of being right, even as the other person withdraws. The subtle relief that comes from pushing someone away before they can disappoint you again. Those moments are revealing. They show that hurting the people we love is rarely about them. It's about how we manage fear, identity, and control when the stakes are highest. It's about what we do when the person across from us matters enough to destabilize us. And maybe that's the final discomfort. The same closeness that allows love also exposes the parts of us that don't know how to handle it. So the next time you catch yourself being sharper, colder, or more careless with someone you claim to love, the question isn't whether they deserve it. It's whether you're mistaking safety for permission, and whether the part of you that feels safest is also the part doing the most damage.